I have a couple questions that I'll give you now, and we can revisit them later after my speech. So, first, thank you all for coming to this. As you know, this is called the Demand of Identity, so it's sort of the organizing queer tactics and grievances of queer workers. So I'm going to sort of focus on a little bit of history of organizing within queer spaces. I'm going to lay out sort of a definition, several definitions of what queer labor is, and then maybe later we can sort of talk about those things in current campaigns. So, some general questions. Thank you to Craig Navarro for helping me make these last night. So I got a couple. So one, can the IWW institute the kind of lasting change that trade unions are capable of achieving with marginalized populations? So things like affirmative hiring, sort of like prevention of sexism and oppressions of all kinds. So think about that today. The second question, how should community relations be factored into our plans for escalation in queer workplaces when we're building a campaign? And I hope to sort of explain why that's been historically a thing that has been quite considered. And then the third one is, how do we organize drag queens? So, all right. So, I'll start with the NDUP, which was founded in 1973. The NDUP is living history. The nightclub remains open today and has persisted for 42 years. It was originally owned by Al Hankin, who was a popular discotheque in the style of Studio 54 in San Francisco. During the 1980s, it was also, like so many other gay bars, losing its patrons to AIDS, instituted straight nights in order to survive. Al Hankin himself died of AIDS-related symptoms in 1989, and his brother, Helmut, inherited the club. Helmut and his general manager, Doug Whitmore, racked the bar's finances and began to sell cocaine from out of the club. Helmut, too, died in 1993 from a gunshot wound. And then the bar was transferred to the third Hankin brother, Carl, who almost died in another gunfight. After Helmut's death, Doug, the manager, stole $100,000 from the bar, only to show up at Carl's doorstep 3 years later in a disguise holding a gun. He shot Carl, ran away, was trapped by the police, and then shot himself. Carl survived, and he continued on running the NDUP. And this is the setting of the industrial workers of the world's only explicitly queer organizing drive, or at least the one I have history for, provided by Dickie Nielsen in the book Nothing in Common. There was in Nelson's work, there was an incredibly absentee owner and a generally absent general manager. The owner showed up long enough to take his money every Monday afternoon, and the general manager wasn't around. According to Nielsen, this provided space for decision-making at the level of the workers, including decisions about hours and scheduling, responsibilities, accommodation for people with certain diseases like HIV and AIDS, and even temporary hiring in situations where workload was too much for them to handle. In the early 1990s, a queer and homeless employee with serious trauma threatened to kill herself while at the bar. The manager allegedly said, if she's going to do that, she should go outside, and so she did, and she shot herself. The other workers were pretty grieved, as you can imagine. The manager quit. The employees one employee was promoted to replace the manager, and then immediately removed the employee's collective schedule and fired the worker with AIDS. Then 2 more co-workers, including Nielsen, were fired. And this began the strike. This lasted 5 months. At first, this included disruption of supply order. Teamsters who delivered the beer to NDUP refused to cross the picket line. Then, of course, the owner, likely Hankin, hired scabs at a U-Haul to pick up the beer from the warehouse. The workers tried to block the scabs from entering with the beer, but police intervened. After these failures, the workers changed their strategy to public relations. This means information pickets and contacting the press, talking to people who were going to the bar. And so this is sort of, as I mentioned, the only IWW campaign really that we have sort of a clear testimony of. It ended by going to the National Labor Review Board, and they settled out of court. So I want to put that aside for a little bit, but I want to come back to that. But for now, I want to sort of move on to a definition of queer labor. So, is there such a thing as queer labor, and how can we conceive of it, and how can the IWW use it? So to begin to explore this question, I'll draw on the work of Alan Beruth, whose name I can't pronounce, and who is a gay historian and an activist. He wrote a few really helpful books here, one of which was on the role of sexuality within World War II, and the other was a bunch of essays on the Marine Cooks and Stewards unions in the 1920s and 30s. So Berub's definition of gay work isn't a celebratory term. He wasn't thinking of fabulous stuff. Instead, it described work that was stereotyped as homosexual, and this largely means work that was thought of as less than or demeaning, or things that naturally women would do, but because it was all male workforce, women weren't there to do them. So during the war, World War II, the US military used different methods to match recruits to positions. Men who presented more effeminately were likely to be assigned to non-combative roles in the military bureaucracy. This included working as clerks, military chaplains, because they could obviously play the organ. But this is, of course, not to say that gay men didn't serve in combat. They did. There's lots of histories about that. I'm not going to go into that. What's of note here is that the military's human resources system attempted to divert effeminate and sort of like gender non-conforming people into specific roles and sort of assign them specific tasks. In the civilian fleet in the 1930s and 40s, gay men dominated the roles of cooks and stewards on civilian ships. Berub interviewed a lot of them, and he has a lot of really interesting accounts. One estimated that 3/4 of his fellow workers were gay, and obviously this is just one person's assessment of the ships. I don't think they were so gay, but nevertheless, a lot of them were. And in fact, a lot of them sort of during the World War II were, if they were like let go by the U.S. military because they were found to have sex with a man or whatever, or a woman in the case of women, they would sort of like hook up with friends on the ships and get jobs that way. So it was sort of like a funnel for people who were dishonorably discharged from the military. So, but the workforce on the ships were largely male, and gay men were assigned roles that would traditionally be considered women's work. They cleaned the ship, waited on passengers, and acted as switchboard operators and clothes washers. They often had to wait on the guests as well. These were some, so where am I? Okay, so we can therefore think of gay work as sort of a social effort to regulate gay men and women, effeminate men, or butch women into participating in certain sectors of the labor market. Usually of lower status. And this isn't just a historical point. So there's interesting sociological studies coming out of McGill University that I want to focus on that I think suggest and provide evidence that this is actually something that still occurs. So the researchers, Waite and Denier, used data from the 2006 Canadian census, which was the first to include same-sex households in the census data. So we're not looking at single gays and single trans people, and they don't really focus on gender identity at all, so think of these limitations. But for people who were in couples, they were able to collect that information. And we're also sort of able to measure on various labor factors between heterosexual and homosexual couples. And they made a series of findings. First, the majority of heterosexual men were concentrated usually in manufacturing, public administration, construction, transportation, and warehousing. That's the biggest one. It's about 20-some%, and retail and trade. Only a third of gay men were within those industries, and a smaller amount of women worked in those regardless of sexual orientation. So gay men were way more scattered both by occupation and industry. So they never really breached 10% of any industry or occupation. But they were more represented in others. So for example, straight men were more represented in manufacturing. It's about 20%. Gay men made up less than 10%. When it comes to, I can find the exact numbers later, but when it comes to public service, sales, retail, administrative work, gay men were more represented in those compared to heterosexual men. And for gay women, it was also way more spread out. There was no sort of clear concentration. So what you're seeing is sort of a concentration within the labor force based on sexual orientation. The second major finding is that gay women and men make on average less than heterosexuals, including in industries they are overrepresented in. So for example, about 2% of working straight men were within the sector of accommodation and food services. They earned on average $34,000. This is in contrast to the 6.29% of working gay men who earned on average $26,000. And the 3.6% of gay women in the sector who earned $27,000. It was a big takeaway message: heterosexual women still made less than anyone. And so there's lots of different ways we can cut this and think about this. I just really want to focus on sexual orientation today, but maybe in the discussion we can come back to that.
So those stats are from what year?
2006. But they've recently redone it with 2006, 10, and whatever data 12. I don't know how often they do that specific census data sample, but they haven't changed. So there's been no significant decreases in the gap of pay between heterosexual and homosexual respondents. And also, as far as I understand it, trans people are still not included in the census information, at least for this particular these labor questions. So over the last 2 years, you probably noticed there's been sort of a sea change in attitudes towards queer people. There's more media representation, more sort of affirmative policies that exist, but this doesn't mean that the end of discrimination is over, nor does it mean that, or the age of discrimination is over, or does it mean that it's only limited to like sensational cases like Kim Davis. The Williams Institute, which is an LGBT legal operation, reviewed 15 studies published from the 1990s to 2009 and found that 15 to 43% of LGB workers experience some form of harassment on the job, which can range from physical and verbal abuse, negative job evaluations, or being denied a promotion. The range was 20 to 57% of trans workers. And this doesn't necessarily mean it's getting better. So what the second paper that Wade published found was that younger gay men and women have higher pay discrepancies between their heterosexual counterparts than older people. So the pay gap between older straight and gay workers is smaller. So they're more equivalent in terms of what they're making. It's younger ones who are who have the highest pay gap. And this is what they think, the researchers think, is the result of a coming out bias. So that there has been this sea change, there has been this more affirmative atmosphere, means that gay men and women and trans people, of course, although of course it wasn't mentioned in the census data, are coming out and feel more comfortable coming out, but they're still reaping the repercussions of that in terms of wage discrimination. But the risk is especially pronounced, and sort of the risks of coming out is especially pronounced for trans workers. 26% of respondents to a US-based national transgender discrimination survey reported losing their job directly due to their gender identity and expression. So these rates were the highest for respondents who were Black, multiracial, and Aboriginal respondents, showing, of course, that discrimination can be layered. And the report includes a really interesting and sad quote from one respondent. Which goes, quote, "I was making 40K. I went from making 40K to nothing. I can barely get a part-time job at a fast food restaurant." And this same survey found that 11% of trans respondents, said that they turned to sex work as a means of procuring income. So the data shows that queer workers are disadvantaged within the labor market, face specific types of discrimination and oppression, and trade unions, that's a different paragraph. So anyway, face types of discrimination and oppression. Trade unions and the state have actually, we must admit, made progress in terms of addressing some of these barriers, but not all. And some of the ways that these are addressed maybe through like a human rights tribunal or other sort of mechanisms that are often slow. The things that we as wobblies usually talk about for grievances, these are the same factors that any trans worker or any queer worker is going to face when they're sort of dealing with these issues of discrimination. Now, if they're in a union, there may be some sort of a trade union, there may be some additional benefit, but of course these things can happen. If you're in a large trade union and the trade union isn't very active in doing things to sort of stop and prevent sort of discrimination, whether it's verbal, physical, or pay differences, then it's very difficult. It's just sort of the same challenges that someone in a non-union workplace would face. So I believe that the IWW can address some of these issues. Opposing homophobic managers is a clear and winnable campaign, even in a smaller shop, and I think also addressing the issue of gender-neutral bathrooms is something that even smaller shops that are non-unionized can sort of have as a clear win and a clear campaign. However, we have to ask, what about hiring? Can the IWW institute affirmative hiring policies kind of like a trade union does? Can it prevent actually, a little research I forgot to tell you was that if you give managers a list of resumes or CVs, and those resumes indicate somehow that they're maybe involved in the queer community, maybe they volunteered somewhere, like a helpline, they're less likely to get a call back. So there's a lot of barriers within the labor market, and I think we should think about whether the IWW can address those in its current state. But for now, I want to shift focus a little. So far, I've been talking about this queer labor as a phenomenon as that happens in the general labor market. But I actually want to now focus on the village and the work of building it, because I think there's also queer labor that is sort of directed and sort of used for its own ends, not necessarily within the general labor market. And I think there's a really interesting history there that we can think about. And I had to take a glass of water. So during my undergraduate degree, I made friends with some baristas at Second Cup in downtown Halifax. They were gay, and so were many of the other employees there. And those that weren't were often fiercely supportive, what we would then call fag hags, and now not call fag hags. We all hung out, we went to the bars, we went to parties together. I was just a customer, but I knew that the barrier between work and life there was very porous, and there was something very fun about that. It was a little manic, sometimes very spiritual, but it wasn't a coincidence that they all worked there. The manager, I later learned, was gay, and whether consciously or unconsciously, hired a lot of gay workers. And because so many gay men worked there, and so many queer people were customers, it set a tone. It wasn't just a reputation, it was something demonstrable. There was something about this Second Cup, as opposed to a suburban Second Cup, that was different. So, for many years, the store was the only on Spring Garden Road to display a lone rainbow flag on that commercial strip. Pride celebration was very pronounced, and they had an actual sort of like festival at that Second Cup. And when a prominent activist in Halifax died, who was part of the youth project I was a part of, there was a memorial at that Second Cup. So it's quite clear to me that this was a different branch or franchise than, again, down the street or in the suburbs. It was it was different because of the employees. In their day-to-day work, they built that tone. They camped it up, sometimes flirted with customers, not me, and gave one another free drinks. I got the free drinks. So I was an honored recipient of their stupid over-roasted coffee, and each cup was sort of like kind of an affirmation. You kind of felt like you were part of something. It was also the perfect spot for blind dates on gay.com and manhunt.com, which were like then what we used, but I digress. But, you know, and despite some people not liking that, and they're like, oh, I don't want to go to the cup, everyone in the queer community had an opinion on it. So far I've used Baruch's definition of gay work as sort of a process by which gay men and women, and also we can generalize to trans people, have been directed towards more marginalized work and often for less pay, often facing unique forms of discrimination. However, I'd like to argue that perhaps queer work isn't only defined as unique features of the general labor force, but of labor all on its own. So in his book, Gay New York, historian George Chauncey argued that while gay bars and spaces in the 1920s Greenwich Village and Harlem existed, they weren't so concentrated as to set the tone. And for him, the tone is an idea of spatial concentration. It's a tipping point which challenges the character of a space, or changes the character of a space. So I think this is not only useful for understanding neighborhoods, and I think we should understand sort of tones of neighborhoods, including a queer neighborhood that way, but also individual workplaces. So to go back to my example, there was something different about that one cafe as opposed to another cafe. And I think that tone is generated by customers and the workers. And there's many kinds of work that can set the tone for what we would call a queer business. But I want to focus on one in particular, and that's drag queens. And the reason I want to do this is because on the left, and just in general, we don't think of this as work. Like, no one really, like, if I was to ask you, like, is drag queen work? I think you would maybe say yes out of, like, fear that I would smack you. But, like, but I think you would have to think about it. It's something people do that isn't work. You can go to a party, you can go to a pride parade, you can go to all these things, and you can be in drag, and you aren't necessarily working. However, a lot of people do procure income off of this. This is work. So I think of, so drag, let me explain, I think you're all familiar with drag queen, but there is something that I think like queer people get about drag that straight people generally don't get. I don't want to generalize too much about y'all, but like, and I think that is based on experience. Drag is sort of the complete form of camp. Camp is an aesthetic that really derived out of our experiences of having to sort of hide who we were inside and present as someone else on the outside. And drag is the fuck you to that. Obviously, you know what a drag queen looks like, you know that they're in drag. It is a complete and sort of like, is a complete representation of I don't give a shit If I have to hide, I'm out. So, and, you know, it's something that boldly celebrates and throws back in the face sort of the discrimination we feel. It's an affirmation. So, not all queers have seen drag shows, most have, and most understand what it is and feel it more keenly. And it means something quite different, I think, for me, when a queen kind of lip syncs a Triumphant Torch song, but it kind of just says, yes, I can overcome, yes, we can survive, we are worthy. So drag is a cultural product that is performed, and we must treat the performers, the queens and kings, like workers, like we do actors. And they used to be, there was occasionally drag queens who were unionized. Typically they were in carny unions, if you can believe it, as female impersonators who were part of carnivals that would go around. So this is way back when, and they were affiliated with AFL-CIO. But that doesn't exist anymore, really. Unlike many performers, the theater is usually a bar or a club. Under the IWW model, I think we would treat them as public service workers. Indeed, their responsibilities may not be necessarily just limited to entertaining. If they work as an MC at a bar or club, they also have to advertise drink specials. Recently, I went to a dirty bingo at a gay bar, and between rounds, the MCs, the jerk queens, were bussing tables. They had to mingle with the crowds, generally encourage you to buy drinks, either for you or for them, and mostly for them, and they often have to they're the draw of the bar. So if you see an advertisement for like a nightclub or whatever else in the village, good chance there's either going to be just like a giant fit dude without a shirt on or a queen. Like there's nothing in between. So I think it's hard to separate the queen from the bar, and queens have to work a lot of bars. So what are the conditions of work like? So actually there's an amazing book from the 1960s by a lesbian anthropologist called Esther Newton. It was an inspiration for Judith Butler. I know there's some stupid opinions about Judith Butler in this room, but like you should read that book and then read Butler. And so she dedicated a large portion of this book to working conditions for drag queens. Take the dressing room. She observed that in one bar there was, quote, one slot to each performer, one cube for each performer, 6 in all. They were tiny cubicles created from plywood partitions. Each had a wall mirror, a table made of plywood board, and a chair. Lighting was supplied by one bare light bulb hanging above from the ceiling over each cubicle. It was in the basement. The area was freezing and cold in winter and blazing hot in summer, and she described it as miserably uncomfortable. And of course, you have to think like what a queen is doing. She is getting dressed. That is like a lot of layers. There's padding involved, so she can get the form of like whatever woman she's sort of presenting as at the time. There's like a lot of that makeup is fucking intense. Like so, like it's a lot. And so there's like we wouldn't accept these working conditions for anyone else. And yet these are were the norm in 1960s, and I really don't think, except for really basic sort of exceptions or really unique exceptions, that it has changed much over the last few decades. And so as Newton understood, being a drag queen, as I said, requires a lot of upfront costs, costumes, padding, special heels, makeup, rehearsal time, effort, and queens vary in what they give a show. It can be anywhere from sort of a lazy lip sync, sort of you're just standing there singing My Heart Will Go On, to sort of like a full-out dance number. And they have to often change the routines because patrons are usually regular and they get bored. But for all the glamour and fantasy, drag queens are not well compensated. They may be paid in tips. If you watch videos of queens online, you'll see that they're taking the money, and that's good. But you know, they may not make that. They could be paid from anywhere from like $100 to drink tickets for a night. So, and interestingly, as Craig, my husband, pointed out, because he loves this show called Hey Queen, which only interviews drag queens, it's great. You know, they'll talk about this, and there is consciousness there about it, but usually they think of it, at least the ones who are interviewed, think of it as sort of paying your dues. And I think if we're thinking about this as a union with perhaps the potential to actually organize this group of workers, I think we can think beyond that, but also sort of keep in mind that sort of like consciousness or lack of consciousness in what they're doing. Yet the drag queen is only one example, one great emblem to gay labor or queer labor. The village is composed of many types of work, and it's often hard to establish a full understanding of what business occurs in its borders or even where its borders are. Recently, a research firm conducted a survey of LGBT businesses. They interviewed 547 self-identified gay business owners. This was in the US. The type of industries represented in the sample were quite varied. Arts and creative firms were the most dominant, representing a mere 15%, which isn't that much. Retail and healthcare were the only two public sector industries to reach 5%. This is sort of traditional public service. Food and restaurants were 2%. 70% of the respondents had less than 3 employees. Half had no employees, but over 80% made less than $500,000. A lot of these are like consulting firms, art shops, sort of like direct services that they're providing, like a gay therapist who has his own business would be an example. So these are really small places, and they're often overlooked by large traditional trade unions. Of course, this sample does not represent all businesses in the village. Many franchises that are not uniquely LGBT operate inside it and have loyal gay customers. Here in something with a cup or Starbucks, like Craig and I have like seen patrons helping set up for Pride at the Second Cup or the bar or wherever. Like there's a lot of sort of like participation in the business on behalf of the patrons, and there's sort of like a fidelity there. And I kind of want to, and I want to sort of focus on that a little more. What unites these two groups of businesses within the village, LGBT-owned ones, and those that are just in the village and sort of supportive of the village, is the low-level union density. So these are often looked by trade unions, as I mentioned, thought of as too small or difficult to organize. It's very recent that unions have paid attention to fast food and restaurants, and the results have been mixed, in my opinion. We can have that discussion maybe later. However, I think the IWW does have experience and more history working in this sector. And while I think we have something to gain, I think we should also think about our limitations within those. So first, let me just, I'm going to transition. I'm almost done when we can have a discussion. I want to sort of give some actual real-world examples of organizing in the LGBT businesses. So first I want to focus on the Richmond Street Health Emporium. It was a bathhouse in Toronto, and it's usually talked about in relation to Operation Soap, which was the police raid on the bathhouses in February of 1981. 200 police officers entered 4 bathhouses that night, and at the end of the night, 286 men were charged. And then there was protests in the street immediately. And then from that, there was something called the sort of Committee on Rights to Privacy, but I'm not going to really go into that now, but there's more history if they're interested. But before that, in 1976, David Foreman approached the Hotel Restaurants Employee International here to unionize the Richmond Street staff. Foreman was a member of the Communist Party and part of an organization called GATE, which is Gays Access Towards it was something stupid. They were just off the heels of a recent success of pushing City Hall in Toronto to adopt anti-discrimination language for its employee contracts. Afterwards, David moved on to Richmond Street. According to Foreman, Here was at first hesitant, but approved of his card signing campaign. He had half of the employees, and therefore no vote was required. However, 6 employees, including 3 of the signatories, later filed a petition to the OLRB against the union. By Foreman's report, the campaign was, there was a campaign at management underway. Quote, the boss was throwing a lot of dope parties for workers, and I could not compete, end quote. Foreman told The Body Politic, which was an old LGBT magazine, that shareholders in the business and friends of the owners were also directly speaking with employees. They were doing their own campaign. So Foreman was fired, and Here filed an unfair dismissal, and the employees under subpoena did not admit any pressure for management. The owner offered a $1,000 settlement to Foreman, which he agreed to. And later, under the OLRB supervision, a union vote was held, and 2 out of 9 voted in favor, so it lost. In Toronto in 1981, a member of the International Beverage Dispensers and Bartenders Union, all the members had not received a wage increase for 2 years. When they decided to strike based on this, the Hotel Association of Metropolitan Toronto staged a preemptive lockout. 2 of the longest-standing gay bars in Toronto were in this, the Parkside and St. Charles, and they were owned by Norm Bolter, who was a member of the association. All the members locked out their staff at the same time. Many of the bartenders had worked there from the beginning in the 1950s and weren't gay. Bolton had complained to the media that the union had made it difficult to hire gay waitstaff, which is very interesting, and I'll tell you why in a second. So during the strike, he had hired gay scabs. Unionized workers who delivered beer refused to cross the picket line, and Bolton had to pay for delivery, kind of like the End Up strike I mentioned. A group of patrons supporting the union formed Fran's Action Group. I have no idea where Fran came from. And distributed flyers to encourage customers to drink elsewhere. It read, quote, "The management of St. Charles and the Parkdale have made their fortune off of gay people for years by treating us like shit. Now they are treating its employees the same way. Let's stick together." Bolton admitted that patronage dropped slightly, but that things more or less carried on as normal. Eventually, the union as a whole settled with the association for an 18% wage increase over a 2-year period, which no one was happy with. And it's a remarkable moment of solidarity between straight staff and gay customers, and this was based partially on the fact that Bolton had allowed the Toronto police to spy through a peephole in the downstairs basement to entrap unsuspecting gay men. And so they, mostly as customers, fucking hated him. It might not transfer onto other situations, but it does show the complex dynamic that can occur inside queer establishments. During the End Up strike in the 1990s, the IWW used the same tactic of blocking the deliveries, and the unionized Teamsters were happy to comply. When management brought in, I've kind of said this already, but I'll go over it again. So when management brought in private delivery, they too started an appeal to customers. The difference is that they didn't encourage a full boycott of the End Up, but only the bar, not the clubs that ran out of the bar. In Nielsen's word, who's the IWW member who wrote an account, the bar and the clubs were two different institutions. We wanted to draw a very clear line between our struggle and that it was not with the clubs, it wasn't with the community, it was with the owners of the bar. Nielsen thought that this meant that, thought of this as a means by which to introduce class politics to queer people. So they were passing out pamphlets outside as they were picketing and doing all those things. But reading the accounts available, it's unclear how class consciousness was developed. He was very confident it was. I am not so sure. And what did they talk about with customers? What did the leaflets say? What organizing happened after the strike went to the labor board? So also, how successful can we say direct action community building was when Nielsen's, by his own account, they were exhausted after 7 months and went to the labor board. Certainly striking workers should employ whatever means necessary to do so, but there's no discussion on what impact their outreach had. And we talk a lot about escalation within the IWW, and this is something maybe, this is something they clearly didn't want to escalate to, but maybe that's a conversation we can have. So in the few cases of LGBT organizing, the idea of community is sort of a sentimental thread that connects them. We already have discussed the sort of common feeling between queer people as sort of reflected by drag queens that, and sort of like their relationship with other people and other workers who I think establish sort of that tone, that supportive tone. And I think I'm not talking, there's a lot of things I haven't discussed here, but if we talk about who goes to the village, and who needs the village, and there's a great book called There Goes the Gayborhood, ? It's a sociological study on the changing nature of gay villages. That author, whose name eludes me right now, sort of made it clear that, yeah, a lot of people are leaving, they're moving out of the village, but not only is this sort of a central place still for entertainment, for services, all these things, a lot of people just hang out there. And this is sort of this is a place where they know they're kind of more safe. If they're not necessarily working there, and a lot of people do, if you're gay and you move to the city, you have a bunch of CVs, or resumes, where are you going to take them but the gay village? Because that's a place where even if you're more effeminate, even if you're a little afraid of discrimination, you may have more protection there. But on top of that, there's a lot of people who use service there. And I haven't really talked about the idea of commons, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there's a lot of parks and there's a lot of public spaces within there, and they sort of fall within that same tone. So the tone is a village-wide. And what we're finding now is that those sort of places that are kind of queer in tone, that are public, are now being sort of challenged by business improvement areas or whatever else. And so these are other sort of dynamics that are in play in the village. So I think, to summarize, that the IWW can do a lot. I think we're in a position we can already sort of organize successfully on some of these grievances, but that we should think about how identity sort of plays into a campaign and whether or not we are capable of achieving all of those ends, and if not, how. And that's it.